I never believed in a higher power, God, Allah, or anything in between. Not heaven, not hell. I was never burdened by faith. There were no sinners, no saints, just men doing what they could to make something of their lot in life. Nothing more, nothing less. So, when I found myself on death row for the murder of a man I had only meant to rob, I tried to make peace with it. Just another fool whose luck had turned sour. The chapters of my life prior to my incarceration, or rather that particular incarceration, were hardly of any note. I was born poor, I grew up poor, I fell in with a bad crowd, and before I knew it, I was a criminal. While there's no honour among thieves, as the saying goes, I did try to keep within the lines of my own personal code. I never took more than I needed, and if I could help it, I never stole from anyone who couldn't do without. I carried a gun with me on jobs. What burglar worth his salt wouldn't? It was a safety net, a kind of oh shit, last-ditch plan. I never meant to use it, but, to quote an old friend, you bring a gun on a job, sooner or later somebody's going to get shot. And sure enough, somebody did. Unfortunately for me, that someone happened to be an assistant district attorney who had overseen one of my previous convictions. Petty theft. Nothing major. But when he surprised me with the racking of a shotgun, I spun and drew on him, almost reflexively. It was fight or flight, and my body chose fight before my brain could decide. After an admittedly lucky shot landed squarely in the man's forehead, my brain caught up. In a complete panic, my body froze. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't move. I couldn't run away. I couldn't will the life back into that innocent man. By the time the police responded to the gunshot and found me kneeling in the same spot I'd been for close to 20 minutes, I had accepted my fate. I pled guilty, of course. I didn't have much of a choice. The case was made to look like I shot him out of revenge. I didn't want to die, but I could see that it would be a fitting punishment. Which brings me to the incident that occurred during my incarceration. Those 5 horrible nights that turned my entire world upside down. There weren't many men in my cell block. I remember it struck me as odd. The block itself was massive, to be occupied by so few. The cold tile floor seemed to radiate the sickening scent of bleach. Every surface shined if it caught the light just right. Not in a hope can be found in the darkest of places kind of way. More like it was hyper-sterilized, as if our crimes made us so unclean that the ground we walked on had to be purified beneath us. My cell, like all the others, was tiny. 6 feet by 9 feet is what I was told, though something about those claustrophobic walls made it feel so much smaller. Only a bed, a thin shitty mattress on a concrete block, and one of those combination toilet sink things. The cell door had one narrow slit of a window, and a slider near the middle that they fed us through. To describe it in one word, I'd say being shut behind that door, locked away from the world, was lonely. My first night was quiet. The air was unnaturally still, and I still hadn't grown used to the smell or taste of it. The trace of bleach still clawed at my throat. I just lay there. I thought about life. Did I have regrets? Of course. But regretting something doesn't mean it didn't happen. It was quite literally at the end of my rope. What good would wallowing in self-pity do? Late into the night, I thought I heard a sound from the far end of the cell block. A kind of scraping sound. It reminded me of the meal sliders on our doors. Not too long after that, I heard a faint wet sound, like that sucking sound you hear when something sticky finally breaks away. I tried to place it for a long while. I strained my ears to listen for anything else, but nothing came. It was nearly dawn before I fell asleep, and the memory of those distant sounds were brushed aside by the time I awoke. I remember waking around 5 in the morning. There was a kind of electricity in the air. There were guards and medical personnel rushing down the block to another cell. I watched through the thin window as a stretcher with what looked like a body covered in blood-stained sheet was carried out. The medical workers looked like they had seen a ghost, and the guards, they looked like they were all fighting the urge to vomit. There were whispers throughout the day about what had happened. The general consensus was suicide. But if it was, how did he do it? And how did he make such a mess doing it? The rest of the day passed without much intrigue. We followed our routines and did as we were told. When lights out was called, I found myself feeling exhausted. Last night's tossing and turning, followed by the excitement of a surprise death, had left me drained. I was asleep almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. I was startled awake by that wet suckling sound. It was closer this time. I crept to the door and peered out the window again. The angle kept me from seeing anything substantial, though I thought I could see the hint of a kind of wet trail in the moonlight. I heard the metal scraping again. There was no denying it this time. The mill slider had definitely been opened. The nasty, slimy sound continued for a moment. I thought I heard the beginnings of a confused voice, before the entire block fell eerily silent. A looming feeling of dread swept over me. I felt like a child, up past its bedtime. Something in me begged me to crawl back in bed and hide under the covers. So, that's exactly what I did. I wrapped myself in the thin, scratchy excuse for a blanket and buried my face against the wall. I never did find my way back to sleep that night. I was up at the door, watching, the minute I heard the guards call for the medics. I felt like I knew what happened before I saw them carrying out another body. My heart began to race. I wondered if this was all some elaborate new execution method. In Japan, death row inmates are never told the date of their execution. It's some kind of psychological punishment, so that every morning they wake up fearing that today may be their last. I tried so hard to rationalize, to force myself into believing that this was just a new system to speed things along. They were just killing us in our sleep. No fuss, no muss. But then I thought about the guards. The look of panic in their eyes, and the sheer fucking disgust when they saw the bodies. There was no way this was planned. The next 2 nights followed a similar routine. I went to bed at lights out, tried desperately to sleep as much as I could, before that sound, whatever it was, woke me up. Each morning, someone else died. The guards and medics carried them away, and never said a word to any of us. We all understood, though. There wasn't a man on that block who stayed ignorant for very long. Every night, some thing was creeping into our cells. It was killing us one by one, and the thing that terrified me the most, there was only one cell between myself and some sick, twisted death I didn't want to imagine. The following night, I decided that I was done being a helpless victim. I wasn't going to lay there and let that thing kill another one of us. It wasn't as if I was growing attached to the men on my block, but something about being forced to watch man after man die and not being able to do a damn thing about it really got under my skin. Instead of hiding in my bunk when the lights were shut down, I walked straight to the door, my own childlike fear be damned. I stood watch through that window. I had a plan. All I needed was for that thing to finally show itself. I caught myself dozing as the night stretched on. More than once I nearly convinced myself to just lie back in bed to just let it happen. I hadn't slept well since before I was arrested, and it was really starting to take its toll. Just as I felt my body begin to flood with the warmth of sweet relaxation, that all too familiar sound pulled me back into reality so fast I nearly got whiplash. The squelching, slimy, almost slug-like sound made its way across the tile floor yet again. It was like someone was dragging a sack of gelatin, occasionally slapping and smacking the tile as it bubbled along. I strained my eyes against the dark, trying to pick out the slightest hint of detail, when the thing's horrible face slowly pushed into the moonlight. I watched on in horror as the creature, a nightmare come to life, dragged itself painstakingly across the floor. Its upper half loosely resembled a full-grown man. More accurately, it was as if a man had broken every bone in his body 100 times over. The shape was there, to be sure, but it lacked any real structure. The tail half was almost worse. Sprouting from the navel area was the body of a giant putrid maggot. Undeveloped fetus-like legs protruded from the grub-like lower half at random intervals, each bent in odd angles that twitched sporadically. In its entirety, the thing had to be almost 7 foot long. The monster's entire body was plastered in vicious ropes of slime that glistened down to the floor, leaving a tail of ooze in its wake. Its eyes were vacant and cloudy, sunken into gaunt sockets that played eerily with the shadows. The mouth of the thing seemed like it was trying to form words. I listened hard, but only heard guttural, choking whispers. Seeing the creature, I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. I wanted to claw my own eyes out and claw its image from my brain with my bare hands. Instead, I froze. It was fight or flight again. But this time, I couldn't choose either. All of us on this block were doomed. Every one of us. Little more than livestock for this thing's nightly feasts. I listened, tears running down my face, as I heard the metallic sound of a feeding slot being opened. I forced my eyes shut, as I heard it silence the cries of my neighbour. I fell to my knees when I heard the thing tearing him apart, whispering and choking the whole time. When the sound of its feeding finally died down, I forced myself to my feet. I heard the metal slider close behind it. I stared, through stinging tears of horror, as it slid, coated in blood and bile, back towards whatever pit spat it out. I don't know what compelled me to do it. I don't even remember making the decision. But before the thing pulled itself too far out of sight, I had reached up and slammed my fist into the door. For a long moment, the entire block was unnaturally still, as the echoes of my knocking reverberated down the hall. My blood flowed through my veins like a thick slush, carrying chills throughout my entire body. My clenched palms grew slick with a layer of sweat. I held my breath until my lungs cried out for oxygen. Just when I couldn't take it any longer, I drew in a deep gasp of air. The second I did, I heard a frantic, wet slapping across the cold tile floor. I clasped my hands over my mouth and stumbled backwards away from my door. Just as I did, the mill slider began to open. I started to hyperventilate. I tripped over my own feet and crawled back into the wall. When the icy caress of the cement wall crawled up my spine, I saw eyes. Those opaque, dead eyes peered at me through the slider. There was hatred in those fishy globes, a deep, inhuman hatred, as if laying eyes on the creature were some unforgivable sin. The creature pressed its face against the slot. Its fractured bone structure allowed it to squeeze through the tiny space like putty. First came its head, then its shoulders, and in a matter of seconds, the thing had passed through and regained its original shape. It smeared the door and the floor beneath it with crimson as it moved. I pulled myself away from it, up onto the bed. Some childlike reflex took over. If I stayed in my bed, it couldn't get to me. The thing eyed me, unblinking. It scraped its way to the edge of my bed and pulled its slimy torso level with me. It coughed, a wet, phlegmy hacking, before a piece of soggy flesh dislodged from its throat and landed on the bed. The thing began to smile at me, a wild, deranged grin. Its dry lips cracked deep, dribbling thin black trails of liquid down its chin. The thing's misshapen arm raised and extended a jagged finger at me. I forced my eyes shut, praying the thing would leave and never come back. A sound crawled its way deep from within the monster's throat. It struggled to force the syllables through gritted teeth. It was trying to speak to me. It sounded like gibberish, but the sounds were uttered with such malice, such conviction, that it had to have meant something. With a thick, mucusy chuckle, the creature descended to the floor. I opened my eyes just in time to watch it squeeze its disgusting, bloody form back out into the hall. I spent the rest of the night praying to any higher power that would listen. I begged and pleaded to be freed from this awful place before that thing would come back. I made promises to change, to turn my life around. In that moment, there was nothing I wouldn't do to get away from that beast, that crawling messenger of death. I must have collapsed at some point, because I was roused by a guard opening my cell and forcing me to my feet. The commotion in the halls was too much to process too soon after waking. I was hastily cuffed and escorted out. To my surprise, all of the remaining inmates were being led out as well. The guards seemed panicked. We walked single file outside and into a transport bus. As I passed by, I couldn't help but glance into the other cell that the pale freak had visited last night. What I saw. The prisoner was on the floor of his cell. Medical staff hadn't even bothered to remove his corpse. His face had been ripped open at the jaw, the skin splitting from how far it had been stretched. His throat and chest looked collapsed, as if every bit of support had been removed from the inside. His gut lay burst open. Remnants of half-eaten entrails lay strewn about the cell. He looked like a bomb had gone off inside him. I couldn't help but imagining the creature forcing its way into the man's open mouth, compacting itself and slithering into his abdomen, eating him from the inside out. We were all transferred to various prisons. I heard one of the men managed to appeal his death sentence. He ended up getting life without parole in a much nicer place. I couldn't help but feel like something heard me when I prayed that night. Something listened and acted to save me, save us, from the horrors of that place. I don't know that I would call it God, but for saving me from that nightmare, it's close enough.
Hello listeners, if you enjoyed this story, please check out the author in the description. For more content, leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more sinister readings.